Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I am a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. And I have been doing this podcast for a little bit now, and we've managed to cover a variety of really fun topics, a lot of things that I hope people have been finding insightful and helpful wherever they are in their writing journeys. This podcast is called Fantasy Writing for Barbarians because I don't want it to just be a podcast for beginners. Of course, if you are a beginner writer, I think this can still be very helpful and useful information. However, if you have been writing for a while and you've been working on maybe your second book or third or fourth, and you've been struggling to maybe make it past that hurdle of writing something that you're really proud of, or feeling the courage to share that book with the world, or at least a few people you really love. Well, that's kind of where I come in here. And I have noticed, too, that a lot of folks who have written into the show, who've reached out, kind of giving me an idea of where they're at with their writing and what kind of stories that they want to do. A lot of them struggle with the same thing, which is that they don't know where to start, or they feel blocked. They feel like they can't bring themselves to go for it, where they might have an idea, they might have that itch to write, but it's intimidating and it can be very overwhelming. I can definitely relate. I haven't talked about this too much, but I certainly didn't see myself as a creative writer for a very long time. Like growing up, it's not something that I really envisioned for myself. It wasn't until I was inspired by other people, friends and colleagues, who I saw the joy, honestly, that prose and fiction really brought to them, that I did realize it was in me too. And that's why I think people need to understand that it's a choice, really. It's something that everybody has maybe their own level of how innate writing can be for them, if it's very natural to them or it's something that sprung from an early age. But at the same time, I think that a lot of people, you choose to be a writer. You make that choice that you want to sit down and take this on. So don't forget that, of course. And with that, let's get into today's advice prompt. Now, we have our producer, Natalia Emmons, who has sent me a few prompts here, and I'm going to open up the first one. And for those of you who are wondering, to this point, I think there's only one time where I've actually just skipped the first prompt. I always go with the first one. The reason I skipped one time was because I think I was having trouble reading it. I was having trouble really grasping what the person was trying to say, because I think English wasn't their first language. I felt very bad about that, but that's only happened one time in about 12 to 14 episodes, wherever we're at this point. Anyway, just a little fun fact. Now, of course, I'm going to go through this prompt that Natalia sent me, and then at the very end of the show, we will have a nice little fact-checking section. Our other producer, Bridget Surdock, is going to let me know if I got anything wrong or if there's anything else we can expand upon with the question or the comments. But with that, let's get into our prompt for the day. This one comes to us from the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. It's going to be linked in the show notes, as always, if you want to follow along. And this one comes from username Vazizer333. And they write prologue, prelude, chapter 0. Interesting. So it's those three different things, but separated by hyphens. So maybe they're trying to choose between what they call it. Okay, could be interesting. Greetings. I'm a new writer and have a doubt. I have a prologue which briefly and rapidly explains the dynamic of the world. Less than 500 words. Third person. I didn't get too deep, as from this subreddit, I understand it's wrong to throw in everything at once at the start. Correct me if I'm wrong. Then I have a story of a villain, which is quite long, about 12,000 words. First person from his perspective. Then the main story starts some years after the events of the villain's story. Third person. These are my questions. How could I implement this? Would it be right to do the prologue, followed by the villain's story, and then the main one? Could I call the villain's story a prelude or chapter 0? Is the change in perspective strange? Third to first, back to third. Thank you so much in advance. Have a great day. Well, I'm going to start with this. Don't do it. In the case of this story, don't do a prologue, don't do a prelude, don't do a chapter 0. Now, if you were going to do it, you can call it whatever you want. At the same time, typically, I would just not do chapter 0. I think that, first of all, some people might akin that more to sci-fi, but also it comes off as a little bit too cheeky. I think prologue or prelude is just fine. Only thing is, if you do prelude, then you should be consistent. You should have, if you have a section in the middle, for example, that's not a chapter, it should be an interlude. And if you have an epilogue, that should be a postlude. So you shouldn't have a prelude and an epilogue, if that makes sense. But anyway, in the case of your story, I would not do a prologue based on what you're writing here. And the reason is because, well, one of the number one criticisms that I see, and honestly that I give, I think I've brought it up before on this podcast, in fact, is that most books tend to start in the wrong place. And in yours, you would be starting in the wrong place if you start from the villain's perspective. And I think the main reason I feel so strongly about that is because a lot of the things that you can communicate with a villain should be communicated not through a prologue and not through a situation where we think that they're the main character, but they should be communicated more organically and not through their perspective. I also would heavily push back against doing first person and then third person. Main reason, people have preferences for POV, big preferences. And I've talked about this before. The beginning of your book sets up promises. And if the first chapter, I don't care if you call it a prologue or a chapter 1, the first chapter, the first thing they read is prose in the first person, not just, a little excerpt or something, then you switch over to third person, that is going to be very frustrating for most people. Now, I understand you might be listening and say, well, hold on, John, Name of the Wind does that sort of thing where it's third person and then it's first person, right? Well, unfortunately, you are not Patrick Rothfuss. I'm not either. And here's the thing. I know I've talked about this before, actually, because we had a whole thing about the risks and rewards of POV, and we talked about this a bit. So just as a reminder, the main thing with POV is that if you are a new writer, you are probably not experienced enough to handle the back and forth and doing both well. You need pragmatically to focus on honing your skills with just one POV. It's hard enough to do either third person or first person. You're putting way too much work on yourself if you're going to try to bounce between the two. Now, I understand they said it's just 500 words, but here's the thing. If it's only 500 words, that's why I question whether or not you need it. And if you just want to have a kind of like atmosphere setting thing, I don't think setting the atmosphere of your story through the villain's perspective is going to be very helpful. Main reason is because then you get to the protagonist, the atmosphere and the tone is probably going to be totally different. And again, if you lead with one thing and then you quickly switch it up on the reader all of a sudden, then that's going to be very jarring. It's going to create, I think, a gap. It's going to make it harder for the reader to immerse themselves in the book. Again, a lot of really experienced writers, masters of the prose, even they sometimes aren't able to pull this off. So you probably can't. I hate to say it, but that's most likely the case. Now, I know this from experience. I've written a novel my first novel actually, where I started the whole thing, not from the perspective of a villain, but I had this really long prologue and I realized that I don't need it because a lot of the things that the prologue communicated, things about the world, things about, the stakes of the story moving forward, I didn't need the prologue to do any of that stuff. I was able to set that up just fine through the main text of the story. And here's the thing. I was able to get to the point a lot faster. And I wasn't giving my readers a very frustrating set of text that they feel like that they have to sift through knowing it's a prologue. That's why a lot of people are averse to prologues. Now, that said, there are examples of prologues that can be done very, very well. And one that I always turn to, I don't know if I've brought it up on this podcast before, but one of my favorite prologues is the prologue for Feast for Souls, which is C.S. Friedman's, the first book in the Magister's trilogy. And that's a really good prologue because it's really just a good short story. It's kind of just good on its own. You don't need anything else to it. It features a main character or I shouldn't say main character, but it features a central point of view character who we never see again, who it's literally just a very short sort of excerpt. And the purpose of it is extremely, extremely useful. You wouldn't be able to have the book work as well as it does without that prologue, because the prologue sets emotional stakes in addition to also communicating the limits and the downfalls of the magic system as it relates to women. And so when you get to the main text of the story where a woman is facing the same thing, that prologue amplifies it. And that is what makes that prologue so good. It supports the story, but if you just read it on its own, it's also just captivating on its own. Whereas I think a lot of people view prologues as just a delayed chapter 1. They just sort of use it as this is really my chapter 1, but because it's not the main character, I'm calling it a prologue. And that is what's frustrating to people, because then it starts to feel like there's no point to it. And a lot of the time, it's very difficult to retain any of the information you put in there anyway. I would say, even though I'm not the biggest fan of Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings, I do think his prologue sort of works that same way as well, where you have this kind of exciting assassination attempt set piece thing. And that said, right before that prologue sort of thing, he also has like a pre-prologue, if I recall. And that one I can't stand. That one, it reminds me of the Eye of the World, the first book in the Wheel of Time. That prologue, which is just like, it's supposed to be enticing. It's supposed to be like, ooh, what's going on here? But it just reads so poetic and mythic that it always throws me off. And I think that like I almost put the book down because I was like, this is just a weird, I don't understand anything that's going on here. And, you know, I think the reason Robert Jordan got away with that is because he was writing in a totally different time. He was writing in the post-Tolkien fantasy kind of environment where a lot of people also, you know, were, you know, the Shannara Chronicles and stuff like that had also come out at this point, and people were just really into that sort of like, let's pretend that we're literary writers, but it's fantasy. Like that's a whole motif that I think sometimes modern writers confuse and get wrong. And so I would shy away from that completely. I don't think it's a good idea. And I think that when it comes to the stakes and everything, you want to start as late in the story as you possibly can, as you possibly can. It's a hard thing to do, I understand. But if you do it, chances are really, really good that the story is going to work a lot better. And you might be thinking, I have all this great material. Save the material. You can, you know, little things about it can pop up later. And if you feel like, well, I need to communicate this thing, well, you can still communicate it in a different context and in a way that doesn't feel bogged down. So yeah, it's very tricky when you're doing the chapter 1, because I do think people with fantasy struggle so much with getting this right. They struggle, you know, to make sure that their world makes sense. I totally get it. And just remember, beta readers can be so helpful with that. The best thing you can possibly do is try to cut as much exposition as you can so that the beta readers can let you know if something is confusing and needs to be explained. And then it's a lot easier to fill these things in after you have, you know, when you have more of a streamlined prose. But if you try to cram this stuff into a prologue, and again, for 500 words, I just don't see what the function would be that would be worth, you know, that adversity that you'd be putting onto the reader. Because most readers, for good reason, shy away from a story, or they get an idea, a false sense of the story right away if they see that prologue. And I don't want that to happen to you. That would be very sad. So let me make sure too that, you know, I look at these comments here because I'm very curious what people, you know, might say to this. And I did kind of see this thing. I have a story of a villain, which is quite long, about 12,000 words, first person. Yeah, this is a terrible, terrible idea. You need your story, especially if you're a beginner writer, to fit the six act plot structure. And if the first 12,000 words, I don't even have your main character, and then you switch at that point, 12,000 words, I mean, that's a few chapters. That is not a good idea. That is setting up your novel to honestly, like, really struggle, because then the pacing is going to be totally off. People are going to be like, when does the story start? Right? And the villain's perspective, at a certain point, if you have that many chapters devoted to the villain, especially at the beginning, that doesn't tell me they're the villain, because you're telling me, are they the antagonist? And if they're the antagonist, how do I know that if I don't know who the protagonist is? And then if you just say that they're the villain because they're evil, first of all, that makes me worry they're going to be one-dimensional and they're just going to be evil and not interesting. But then second of all, if you do make them more sympathetic because we have so much time with them, then I'm going to be sympathetic and I'm going to view them as a protagonist. And that's going to be so confusing. And also, if you spend that much time with one character and then you jump to another character, I'm going to be like, well, maybe I like this character. If things are going right, if you are writing this really well, and I'm suddenly switching over to somebody I don't know and I don't care about at that point, that's going to be way too frustrating. Take a look at some of your favorite fantasy novels. Pay close attention. Not just novels, look at movies, some of the best movies ever made, and pay attention to when the main character comes in, how much information we get about the main character at the beginning and how we're introduced to them. And then, how does the villain stuff get spliced in? Now, movies will sometimes have like a little slice of like a villain story, but not a lot of them. And usually it's like a sequel. Usually it's something like, for example, The Dark Knight Rises or The Dark Knight, where the beginning of those films all settle and kind of give us an idea. Here's the Joker, here's Bane. Batman Begins doesn't do that, if I recall. I believe Batman Begins just kind of gets started with Bruce Wayne. And because, of course, he's our main character, we can't delay getting to know him. That wouldn't work. If we had The Dark Knight and you didn't know who Batman was, that'd be a very confusing thing. And you'd be like, who's this guy? Right? It doesn't work that way. So there's a reason these plot structures, I know it can maybe seem like, well, I want my book to be different. You want it to be different in the right ways. You don't want it to be so different that people can't wrap their heads around it and that they have an unpleasant experience. And it does also sound like if I'm reading a bunch of stuff from the villain's perspective and they're not the main character, you are giving me a certain type of emotion. You're giving me dread. You're giving me like, oh, I hate this person. Oh, this person is bad. This world is grim. Then what are you going to do when you have the main character? You're not going to be able to elicit those same emotions to the same effect. And then if you try to give me joy or charm or something like that, I'm going to be like, well, what is this book? Like, this book can't make up its mind. It's all over the place. It'd be like watching, the Game of Thrones, and then like 3 episodes into Game of Thrones, all of a sudden you give me an episode, like the first episode of like, I don't know, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. I'd be like, what? Make up your mind. Like, this doesn't make any sense. So in terms of tone, I understand that logistically and coherently that wouldn't make sense. But yeah, you get what I'm saying. All of these scenes that you are writing in your chapters, they need to ladder into each other. They need to inform each other and feel like they're part of one woven path. And it's not a good thing when you are chunking your novel. You're taking big chunks and you're just kind of like forcing them all to sit next to each other because you have one idea and you won't leave that idea. So again, pay attention to how other books do this and learn from those books. Don't just try to do things for the sake of them and think that it'll all work out, especially when you are a new writer, because chances are good you're just going to end up wasting a lot of time and then you're going to throw out your novel because it's not working. Why isn't it working? Well, chances are good that that's why. All right, so let's look at some of these comments here. Let's see what other people have to say. It's Cheshire writes, so the prologue, prelude question comes up a lot, and the general rule of thumb seems to be don't. Many writers use it as a sort of info dump, a way to contextualize a lot of necessary setting info before starting with the main story. All right, I agree with this so far. The reason these things are in quotes is because both of those, totally understandable, feelings are just traps for new authors. There's no such thing as setting info that's so necessary, it needs its own little mini chapter. You could convey it all in the opening chapters of the story, even without interrupting the flow of the events to info dump. And there's no main story, at least not with a novel. You get one story, and you have to make that work. I really like this. I mean, I think that that's such a great way to put it, and I really agree. It's one story, and I do think that a lot of new authors do run into this trap. But at the same time, what I was trying to say before, if you do the prologue, it can work as a mini story. But just remember, as a mini story, it still needs to support the main story and what the point of the main story is. The main story, again, for Feast for Souls, there's magic in the system that is basically sexist against women. That's how it works. And the prologue is a mini story about how that works. And it tells us the emotional stakes of that so that when the main story kicks off proper, you have that context. It can work, but here's the thing. C.S. Friedman, prolific writer, really good at this. She was able to do this successfully for a reason. Most writers aren't going to be able to pull off that nuance, so you're probably better off not trying to do something very difficult and just focus on making your opening chapter as good as possible. That's my advice anyway. Cheshire continues. There are a lot of cool models for story structure out there, and some of my favorite stories do tons of head hopping, frequent perspective changes. But if you feel like your story requires a 500-word prologue and then a 12,000-word mini-story about your villain in order to make sense, what you have is a bad story, not in the sense that there's nothing there or that you shouldn't write it, but in the sense that you're thinking about how to convey it incorrectly. Yes, I agree with this as well. And I think that it goes back to something I brought up before, which is that you should always be conforming your novel to a well-defined pitch/premise. The sort of thing that if you wanted to get this traditionally published, and I don't know if OP wants to do that, Vizizer, I think their name was, I don't know if they want to get traditionally published, but on the off chance that they do, and they wanted to send this to agents, then 100% they need to have a pitch or a premise. And there's no, in my mind, feasible way to do a successful pitch or premise where you have a prologue that's 500 words and then a 12,000 mini story with the villain and then the main character. Because if you have that pitch premise and there's like, this is a story about the main character, and then the agent reads that, it's like, okay. And then they read, the first thing they read has nothing to do with the main character, that 500 words. And then even if they keep going, and I doubt they will, into that 12,000 words, they're going to put it away and they're going to just say like, nope, not for me. So yeah, you are setting yourself up for a rejection very, very quickly in that. And look, you might be saying, I don't care about agents, whatever. Well, the same thing's going to happen with readers. If you try to entice them with like, this is a book about this, this, and this, and you're trying to market the book in that way, and then you give it to readers and they like get into it and they're like, nothing's happening, then not only are they not going to finish the book, they're not going to tell other people to read the book, and your book is not going to be successful in the way that you might want. So that's what'll probably end up happening. Trisha had one last little bit here, and this is really good. I'm glad this commenter came through here. They wrote, my advice, create a bullet point list of all the key info you wanted to convey during the prologue and prelude, and then just start your story on your main character. As you progress through the opening chapters, periodically stop and look at your bullet point list and find some way to slip one of those items into the reader's view without stopping to directly explain it. Yeah, that's one good way to do it. There are other ways too. It really just sort of depends on, I think you should do it no matter what, but I would say that like you might even get to the end of this process and realize you're doing it organically, that a lot of what might be on that list just kind of shows up in the story on its own. And again, beta readers can be helpful where they're like, hey, you know what? I don't understand how this works. Can you explain it a little bit earlier? And you can be like, yeah, I can. Because, you have the prologue, so you have that bullet list already, and then you can just find a place where you can weave that in. That said, I do usually advocate for trying to avoid weaving lots of bits in too haphazardly. So what I mean is going back to your early chapters when you're revising and then adding a bunch of things arbitrarily, because sometimes it could really mess up the flow if you're not paying attention. So always a good piece of advice there is to pay attention to how much exposition you're doing in a row. Highlight text that is exposition so you can get a sense of like, oh my gosh, I have an entire page that is nothing but information. I need to find a way to break this up better. So that can help as well to kind of just keep the manuscript under control. We have a response to this. Candle340 replied to this commenter and said, while that last bit is generally good advice to avoid info dumps while world building, please note, it will not work in all situations regarding prologues. Some stories really do work better with prologues, especially those that are dependent on a framing device of some sort. For example, Patrick Rothfuss's The Name of the Wind. Oh, well, there you go. While Kvothe's story is compelling on its own, so much of his unreliability as a narrator comes from the framing of King Killer Chronicle is dependent on here's a man telling his life story to someone else in the way he wants it to be told. It really just comes down to one question you need to ask yourself. Is the story I want to tell best told in this way? Again, though, that is the exception to the rule for a reason. The reason Rothfuss was able to do that is because this was not his first book, I don't think. I fact-checked me, Bridget Surdock. I'm pretty sure Patrick Rothfuss had written a lot of stuff before this. I could be wrong. But, I mean, when you read Name of the Wind, it's so clear that this man just has like a mastery of fantasy craft that can't be denied. And most books are just not going to be to that level. And I also would say, too, that I got to be honest, the beginning of Name of the Wind, it doesn't feel like a prologue. It doesn't feel like a delay of the story. It feels like we're just starting the story and I'm getting led into this world kind of slowly and organically. And then the whole Kvothe stuff, that just sort of continues the story, kind of to what that other commenter Cheshire was saying. It feels like it's one main story. They're just using different framing devices. And my only point is that switching framing devices is a very complicated and difficult thing to pull off if you're not very experienced. So all that said, just be very, very careful with your prose and be very, very careful with your framing and how you do this stuff, because it can just really be jarring to readers if you're not good at it. All right, Atavistic Scallion writes, people get all bent out of shape about a prologue/prelude, yet there are plenty of instances where they beautifully set up a book. Yeah, again, because they're done by the masters. I hate this like thing where it's like, why do people hate prologues? Prologues are used all the time. Yes, by people who are really good at this. And chances are just better that you're not because you are a new writer. Look, I've written a bunch of books at this point, and I don't write prologues anymore. I tried to do prologues before, and honestly, for the kind of, at least for the books that I write, I just want to get right to the point. And also, I think that a lot of newer readers just don't have a lot of patience for prologues. And you are writing for newer readers. You're writing for younger readers than people from 10 years ago. So this whole thing of like, well, other people get to do it. It's like, yeah. And people who play professional sports, do all kinds of things that look really cool. But if you try to do them, you're going to like break your butt. Like that's just unfortunately how it works when you're not, when you are starting out. But anyway, they keep writing. Anthony Ryan's Bloodsong or Scott Lynch's The Lies of Locke Lamora come to mind. The former shows the man you'll see develop in the book through the eyes of a man who hates him. The latter shows a child's troubled beginning, and they're totally essential and draw you in, me at least. That said, I'd have very low expectations for a 500-word prologue and then 12,000 words straight about the villain. You might want to peek at those to see what a good prologue can accomplish. See what they can tell you, or see what they tell you about the world/characters. They're much longer than 500 words, but far more concise than 12,000. Both are very well executed, in my opinion. I will say, I haven't read Bloodsong, but definitely Lies of Locke Lamora. That is a good book. And again, that is a book written by somebody who is just a master. And I think that there are just so many examples of prologues that aren't done well. Even the ones that are published, that unfortunately you can also point to and be like, okay, well, this book has a terrible prologue. But then you can look at, a Game of Thrones, a good prologue, but a lot shorter than people might think. And again, prologues should follow a set of basic standards. And the issue really here is that a lot of new authors don't have a good sense of those standards. And they use prologues typically as a crutch, as a way to sort of be like, I have to introduce the reader to my world before I can introduce the main character. But honestly, readers are probably going to have a much easier time getting invested in your book by getting invested in your main character. So again, if you take way too much time to give me a reason to care about your main character, then I'm going to have a harder time caring about the book itself. I'm going to care more about a book if I care about the main character, the setting and all that stuff. Mistborn, just taking it back to Brandon Sanderson again. Main reason I think Mistborn kind of hooked me when I first read it is because I liked Vin. I liked Kelsier too. You start with Kelsier, and he's an interesting character, and he's one of the main characters. So when you get to know Kelsier and Vin, yeah, honestly, if I'm being for real, a lot of the world of Mistborn doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's not that interesting of a setting. The most interesting things about Mistborn are the two main characters in that first book, The Final Empire, and also all the Allomancy stuff. And the Allomancy stuff, we don't really get a good sense of that for a while. It takes a while for us to get any real info on how any of that works. But it's fine because we like Vin, we like Kelsier, and we know some of the macro stuff about the world. And I feel like Sanderson, he didn't feel the necessity to overwhelm us with all this heavy prologue stuff. So anyway, I'm a big fan of how Mistborn pulls that off. And that's just a good, in my opinion, rule of thumb all the way. All right, let's look at one more comment and we'll go from there. So Voltaire Nade, I think we've seen this commenter before, writes, why can't you include some version of those 500 words interspersed in the 12,000 villain origin story? Yeah, that's a good question, And at the same time, I still wouldn't do that. But yeah, it still feels kind of strange that like, why would you need a prologue and then a mini story and then, just streamline, simplify. One of the best things you can learn to do with a novel is to simplify. Look at different parts of it and be like, how do I condense this? And I'm not saying that in all cases, simple always means better. Sometimes I've looked back at, my most recent novel, it kind of just started with chapter 1. And really late in the game, I decided, I kind of want to start with a quote at the very beginning of the novel, or like a juxtaposition of quotes. It's a very quick thing. It's less than a page. And all it does is it just kind of gives you a sense of what kind of story you're getting into, so that once you roll into the chapter 1, it just hits you. But again, all this stuff has intentionality behind it. It has purpose, and it has me thinking about the reader, trying to put myself in their shoes. What is the best way to experience this novel? And in some cases, yeah, it might be to add a little bit of a complication. But if I am adding a complication, it's to support the main story. And so I really like a lot of the advice that came in for this. I hope that the Zizer was able to get something out of it as well. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to our producer, Bridget Surdock, to make sure I didn't say anything too egregiously terrible. So don't go away. I'll be right back. All right, we are back, and I do have my notes from producer Bridget Surdock, and thank goodness, because I have a feeling I said some incorrect things here and there. But let's see what they have to say. They said the first thing here, quote, "Don't do it. Yes, wholly agree." So if you recall, the first thing I said to the prologues, what should I do? Don't do it. Very simple advice. I think it can go a long way sometimes. Bridget also wrote, "Yeah, having a 500-word prologue feels unnecessary. 500 words is 2 to 3 paragraphs. I can't imagine that adding much to the overall narrative. And if it's just exposition, then get it out of there. Get to the story, get to the hook. The thing that will get the readers interested, and then seed the exposition throughout." Yeah, totally agree. I think that is the best way about it. And it's hard too because we don't really understand, or we didn't get much of a sense of what this 500-word prologue was really trying to accomplish. So that is a part of, I think, the bias against it in our favor. But then Bridget also writes, "And then the 12,000-word prelude from the villain's perspective will be incredibly jarring. If the story doesn't pick up until sometime later, get to that point. Start where the story starts." Yeah, I can't even think of an example of a book that does this. I'm sure there is one where it shifts the POV, but not really from a villain. I feel like usually when you do stuff like that, and it's a very experimental book, of course, it's probably something that's more literary. So think of like a movie. So there's a movie called Barbarian where you shift the POV about halfway through, but it's not a villain thing. It's just sort of like an extended cold open, if that makes sense. And again, it's the kind of thing that it's experimental for a reason. It's one of those things, the age-old advice. You can't really break the rules until you totally understand them and you know how to break them correctly. Bridget wrote, "That first commenter was fully on the money. Hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Patrick Rothfuss's first novel was, in fact, The Name of the Wind." Yeah, I feel like as soon as I was saying that, I was like, wait, I might be confusing Patrick Rothfuss's career with George R.R. Martin's, because I think I had A Song of Ice and Fire stuck in my head, and I was thinking about how, Martin had written a ton before the Game of Thrones stuff. He had written for TV, he had written hard sci-fi. He had a pretty long career up until that point, and he had sold successfully with a couple of books, and then he had failed with a couple of his middle books. But yeah, Patrick Rothfuss I know a lot less about. I do know that he is known for taking a long time, though, to write his books. And I think the third book in that series has been long awaited, and people are like, when is it ever going to come out? Maybe that's why I was thinking of George R. R. Martin. Anyway, Bridget wrote, "He wrote the short story The Road to Devonshire, which won an award in 2002, but his first published novel was still The Name of the Wind in 2007. Interesting enough, for some reason I thought Name of the Wind was published in 2005. That's good to know. Bridget wrote, "There was also your annotated illustrated college survival guide, which was released in 2005, but it's not a novel." Okay, yeah, that's 2005, but I've never heard of this, so that's just a coincidence that I thought it was 2005. Bridget wrote, "As an aside, I know a lot," they capitalized it, "a lot of people who will just outright skip a prologue." Yes, I have heard of this too. And I'll be honest, look, I don't skip prologues, but I have skimmed them, or I don't take them as seriously sometimes when I'm reading a book. I will start the prologue and I'll just kind of, I don't know, my mind will kind of see it as like, okay, but this isn't really the story. This is just a thing. And I'm just going to get through this as quickly as possible so I can get to chapter 1. And that's not the best habit to have. I don't usually do that, though, if it's an author that I trust, right? If it's an author like Martin or Sanderson or Tolkien, whoever, if it's an author who I know has a lot of credibility, then I'm going to eat up every word that they write. It's with, it's a little bit more, there's more of a permission structure there. But if it's a debut author, if it's somebody who is well known, but I don't really know them, or I'm going to be a little bit less forgiving, honestly. I kind of did this with Wheel of Time. When I first read that prologue, I was like, what the heck is this? I can't wrap my head around this. Let me just read this quickly. And then, okay, now we're in chapter 1. Now I'm interested. And so I did, for what it's worth, go back eventually and be like, okay, I want to reread that prologue now that I have more context. and it has been sort of referenced a couple of times. So I have done that where I'll reread the prologue later. But again, that's a Robert Jordan thing. It's something that worked in the 80s and 90s, but it's not the 80s and 90s anymore, as Bridget's alluding to. Bridget wrote, some of them just don't want to bother. So they're talking about people who won't read prologues. Some of them just don't want to bother because they think it'll just be exposition, which they're not always wrong. Others have told me that if the author wanted them to read it, if it was that important to the story, it would be the first chapter. I do not count myself among them. I like to read the prologue just to get everything the author put to paper, though I've often found it was entirely superfluous. Yeah, that's about where I am too. Again, it just comes down to who the author is, and there is this whole thing where I do think we're in a situation where there are a lot of people, a lot of younger people, a lot of younger readers entering this space, buying books, for the first time, or buying adult books for the first time as young adults. And I am noticing a bit of like I want to listen to audiobooks on like 3 times speed so I can barely understand what's going on. I just want to consume this as quickly as possible. I just want to like read really fast and not grasp everything. And it can be really frustrating to see that sort of thing taking off, especially on things like TikTok, because, I just see people sort of not taking the book or the prose very seriously and letting it sit and marinate the way the author intended. And then they go back and they criticize the book in certain ways where it's like, your critique is kind of born out of your reading issues, like your lack of reading comprehension. It's not because of the book. Like they will literally say something like, this is a plot hole, because like it's not a plot hole because you weren't paying attention to the book. It's the same kind of thing with people who watch movies but are on their phone the entire time, and then they're like, that movie was so boring. It's like, no wonder, like you weren't watching it. You were kind of peeking at it every once in a while, and that's about it. All right, and then Bridget apparently liked my break your butt comment. I don't know why that's what came out of my mouth. I just was like, you're going to break your, and I didn't want to say back, because I was like, this is more serious than breaking your back. I mean, breaking your back is seriously, but breaking your butt, that's something that, as you fellow fantasy authors can attest to, that's high stakes. That's action adventure stuff. And then last, Bridget wrote, yeah, Game of Thrones prologue is so good, and I'm so glad you brought it up. It's good, but it is an example of Martin did that first book's prologue so well that everybody else thinks that they have to copy it, right? And so here's the thing. When Martin wrote Game of Thrones in the 90s, and it was kind of, cutting edge. I don't want to say cutting edge. It's not like this hadn't been done before. But the way he kind of created this like really haunting fantasy setup of like there are these evil creatures that are coming from the north or whatever, and you're from the perspective of the person who dies because of it. And then the whole book is sort of like all the politicking, and people don't even know that this threat is lingering there. It was a great prologue because it created a lot of tension for the story, and it served the theme, right? The theme of Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire in general is that while all these people are busy arguing with each other, the actual threat is going unchecked, and the people trying to stop it have no support. So it's an allegory, of course, for things like climate change. And the thing is, though, people see that and they're like, wow, that's a great example of a prologue. I want to do that too. And then so they try to do their prologue and they just copy it. And yeah, at best, it just comes off as like a bit derivative and a bit like, okay, this is the same theme as this other book you like. What's your spin? What's your kind of, I know we've talked about this a bunch on the show because people have asked, how do I avoid my media influences from taking the originality out of my story? And again, it's like, it's okay. You can embrace your inspirations. You can embrace the fact that a book like, Game of Thrones or Name of the Wind or whatever it is that you grew up on, an anime or something, it's okay to take those things and to embrace what inspires you, but you have to just be self-aware and notice when you're copying them too much. And see where that fine line is and make sure that, okay, if I'm going to do a prologue, how am I going to do it in a way that was innovative in the same way like I was inspired? But I can't just copy innovation. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. So that's the thing that you have to ask yourself when you're in this stage of the process. All right, well, special thanks to Bridget Surdock for our fact-checking and clarifications. I'm sure there were plenty of people similar to Bridget who heard me say that Name of the Wind was that Patrick Rothfuss had written all of these books beforehand. And we're like, ooh, John, you messed up. But fortunately, Bridget came through, so thank you so much. And thank you, of course, as well to Natalia Emmons, our the producer, for finding this prompt for us. And thank you to the original poster of this advice. I hope this is helpful if they end up listening to the show. I should reiterate, I brought this up before, We always send out these episodes to the people who post these advice prompts. We always send them directly through our Reddit. So if you ever hear this and you happen to hear like, oh, this is my prompt, I don't think that's ever happened. But if that did happen, then you will hear from us, of course. And so, yeah, thanks again for listening. Don't forget, we have an email if you want to hit us up directly, if you want to send us an advice prompt of your own. Our email is fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. You can also comment on the show via our YouTube channel of the same name. Everything's linked in the show notes if you want to find it, including the prompt that we talked about today. You can find that so you can follow along and read it for yourself and do all that good stuff. But of course, if you go to that prompt, or if you go to any prompt in this show, please never harass anybody. Please never say anything negative or demeaning to anybody ever. That hasn't happened before, and I'm just hoping that it never ever happens, but I understand human beings are who they are. So yes, we got to be cool to each other. Got to be nice. But all right, thanks again so much for listening, and hey, be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.